We saw with Spain that consolidation rested heavily on religious conformity. For the victor in the Hundred Years' War, that is, for France, consolidation rested in another direction. As we'll see, French monarchs will begin to rely on territorial consolidation that aided monarchical consolidation. As you know, the Hundred Years' War had in part been sparked by a succession crisis, which saw the end of the direct Capetian royal line, which had ruled France since 987, because Edward III of England was ineligible to inherit the French throne. So, succession to the French throne shifted to a new royal house, the House of Valois, in 1328. Thus, it was a brand new French royal family, albeit one that had been in power for over 100 years by 1453, that had to deal with the fallout from the Hundred Years' War. While generally supported by the French nobility, who hadn't wanted an English monarch, the Valois kings didn't have the same connections as the Capetians had had, and this, in part, contributed to their domestic struggles during the Hundred Years' War. Charles VII was the king during the last phase of the Hundred Years' War. At the time of his accession in 1422, though, his claim to the throne was tenuous. See, his father, Charles VI, who'd originally been praised as the Beloved but eventually came to be known as the Mad, had disinherited his son Charles in 1420. Apparently, Charles VI had intended to name the English King Henry V, to whom he'd married off his daughter Catherine, as his heir instead. This crazy plan, which wasn't supported by all the French nobles, was further destabilized by domestic troubles. While France was facing the beginnings of what might become a troublesome civil war, as supporters of the ruling Valois dynasty fought against the Dukes of Burgundy. The current Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had married into the Portuguese royal family. Moreover, he was leading a state that, like Portugal, was allied with the English. On top of that, the Burgundians particularly hated Charles the Mad, since Charles's bodyguard had assassinated the previous Burgundian duke in 1419. When both Charles the Mad and his presumptive heir, the English King Henry V, died in 1422, the disinherited son was suddenly very much back in the picture. The French nobility decided to stick with the young Charles, now Charles VII. In the 1420s, Joan of Arc's military successes not only helped the French eventually defeat the English, they also helped Charles VII consolidate his political power. Even Joan's capture and death in 1430, remember the French enemies, the Burgundians, handed her over to the English, didn't stop Charles's momentum. In 1435, as it became clear that France would win the war, the Burgundians abruptly switched sides, now allying with the French after signing the Treaty of Arras. As a gesture of goodwill, the treaty required that Charles VII disavow the murder of the previous Burgundian duke. It also required that the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, ensure that his young son, a boy named Charles, would marry a Frenchwoman. In 1440, Philip made good on the provisions of the treaty. His 7-year-old son was married to a 12-year-old girl named Catherine, who just happened to be King Charles VII's daughter. Thus, the two enemies used the tried and true method of political marriage to ensure peace, and they became in-laws. But did such deep-seated tensions really just go away because a wedding had occurred? I think we know the answer to that one. As a side note, if you're concerned about how this marriage between a 7-year-old and a 12-year-old was supposed to work, good. You should be. The terms of the marriage saw Catherine travel to Burgundy to be raised by her mother-in-law, Isabel of Burgundy. Unfortunately, Catherine died 6 years later, in 1446. Charles became a widower at 13. As far as we know, Catherine and Charles never lived together as a typical married couple would. Without having to worry about Burgundy after 1435, Charles spent the last 2 decades of the Hundred Years' War driving the English from his kingdom. In order to do so, Charles established France's first standing army since the Roman Empire. A standing army is made up of full-time soldiers who were, at the time, a mix of career professional soldiers and conscripts, men who'd been drafted to fight. However, Charles was regularly thwarted in his efforts by his oldest son and heir, Louis, who wanted his father to grant him more authority. Louis was, perhaps, comparing his level of authority with that of his brother-in-law, Burgundy's Charles, who'd been helping his father diplomatically and militarily since he'd been 13. Louis concocted intricate plans to try and wrest some power away from his father, and then they never worked. Frustrated, Charles VII banished Louis, then 23, from Paris in 1446, hoping to put an end to all of his conspiracies. But that didn't work. Louis would eventually exile himself to Burgundy, where he was welcomed into the court of Duke Philip the Good. This move was interpreted as a slap in the face of Charles VII, who, Treaty of Arras aside, still considered Philip one of his greatest enemies. As he neared death in the late 1450s, Charles VII repented of his son's exile and recalled him to Paris. But Louis refused to come. In 1461, ill and unable to eat because of tumors in his mouth, Charles died, and his estranged son Louis became Louis XI, the new King of France. Upon his father's death, Louis, who'd earned nicknames like the Cunning and the Universal Spider because of his penchant for political intrigue, manipulation, and conspiracies, finally returned to France. To be fair, Louis had maybe reason to conspire, at least against his father. In 1436, Louis had been married off to Princess Margaret of Scotland for political reasons. Louis was 13 at the time. Margaret was just 11. Louis and Margaret did not get along and spent little time together. Charles, however, liked Margaret and doted on her, to Louis's consternation. Margaret died in 1445, and just a year later, Louis was banished from the French court. Louis hadn't been complacent while he'd been away from France. He continued to lobby for his own authority. In early 1451, the 27-year-old arranged his own political marriage to Charlotte of Savoy, who was only 9 at the time. Savoy was then a duchy, which straddled the traditional borders between France, the Italian peninsula, and the Swiss Confederation. Louis decided to marry Charlotte because doing so gave him a territorial claim to lands in northern Italy. When he became king 10 years later, Louis lived up to his nicknames. He suppressed many of his former co-conspirators, that is, his friends, on grounds that they now threatened his rule. As you can imagine, his former friends were quite surprised by this suppression. Louis also hired educated commoners to help run his government. These men would eventually form a new nobility, the nobility of the robe, who'd earned their noble status thanks to their role in supporting the French government. The existence of these new nobles and their influence would challenge France's traditional nobility, the nobility of the sword, who'd earned their status during the Middle Ages by supporting French kings as vassals through the feudal system. Louis would travel incessantly throughout France to make sure his officials, these new nobles, were doing their jobs. His travels led to the creation of France's system of royal postal roads, which were built to ensure that Louis's messages to his officials were delivered quickly. Louis was also fiscally conservative as a king, and so he grew the French treasury. Of course, part of the reason he was able to do so was because he disbanded his father's professional standing army. Louis also looked to expand his influence throughout Europe, and so he supported his fellow rulers when doing so would also benefit himself. For instance, in the early 1460s, his former protector, Philip of Burgundy, wanted to fund a new crusade. Louis offered him cash money, 40,000 crowns, in exchange for some Burgundian territories. Philip's son and heir, Charles, who was already called the Bold, protested this move, fearing that his patrimony was threatened because he worried that Louis was hiding plans to take over Burgundy. Charles led an unsuccessful revolt against his father, which caused trouble, but didn't stop the exchange of territory. France grew, while Burgundy shrank. Duke Philip died in 1467 and was duly succeeded by his son Charles, who, nervous about Louis's intentions, wanted to establish a definitive break with France. However, this was a tricky proposition. After the 100 Years' War, France had gotten much stronger while Burgundy was beginning to fracture. For instance, in the late 1460s, one of Burgundy's cities, Liege, rose up in revolt. Louis XI initially supported the revolt, but In 1468, when the inhabitants of the city murdered their Burgundian governor, Louis found himself having to placate Charles for supporting the rebels. As an apology, Louis returned the lands he'd purchased from Philip. Then, with Louis's help, the two men suppressed the uprising in Liege. Louis continued to play nice while he traveled in Burgundy, seemingly friendly to the Burgundians, but once back in France, he was determined to end Burgundy's autonomy. Charles, perhaps again sensing Louis's intentions, started buying up land in the Holy Roman Empire, hoping to extend his territories. Now, Louis needed to keep track of Charles's actions of his purchases, so he leaned on his connections in the Swiss Confederation, which he had thanks to his marriage into the Savoy noble family, which was partly Swiss. Charles grew worried about this Franco-Swiss alliance. After all, Switzerland bordered Burgundy in the east. In 1476, Charles decided to invade Switzerland to neutralize this potential threat. However, his plan backfired. In January 1477, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles was killed and his army defeated. The death of Duke Charles forced some Burgundian nobles to decide to join the Kingdom of France, so the Duchy of Burgundy shrank by a little bit. Duchess Mary, who was only 20 and was Duke Charles's only surviving child, then immediately faced pressure from Louis XI to marry his younger son Charles, who was 13 years younger than she was. Louis hoped that, through a political marriage, he could annex the entirety of Burgundy for France. However, Mary was advised against this marriage with the French prince by her counselors, who understood Louis's intentions. Instead, Mary chose to wed Maximilian of Habsburg, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, just 8 months after her father's death. Maximilian would become her co-ruler, the Duke of Burgundy. So, while Burgundy was ultimately spared then, the French kings Charles VII and Louis XI were nonetheless able to consolidate their power. Charles did so militarily by establishing a standing army and defeating the English, while Louis XI did so by beginning to professionalize the government with the creation of the nobility of the robe. And Burgundy? Well, very sadly, Mary died in 1482, just 5 years after her marriage, from complications after falling from a horse. However, she managed to give birth to 3 children during her 5-year marriage, 2 of whom would survive into adulthood. Her oldest son, Philip, would become the Duke of Burgundy and would eventually marry Juana, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. That's right, Charles the Bold's grandson would marry into the Spanish royal family which, in the early 16th century, ruled the most powerful empire in the world. Take that, Spider King.